This last video of Chapter 4 deals with cellular respiration. And cellular respiration is another series of chemical reactions that are necessities for life. So we start with the end product of photosynthesis, which is glucose. And glucose is a simple sugar that living things can use to store and transport energy. So how does your body use glucose? It's taken up by your cells after you eat food. So your body digests your food to retrieve the glucose molecules. However, your body can't use glucose directly. It's too powerful. It has too much bang for its buck. So we have to convert it into ATP. ATP is a much more manageable, smaller amount of energy that your cells can use. So cellular respiration is the process in which glucose is converted into ATP, or energy that your body can use. And we can, out of one glucose molecule, we can make 38 molecules of ATP. So ATP can form when you take ADP and it gains a phosphate group. This requires some energy. So let's take a look here at ATP first of all. ATP, the T or triphosphate indicates that there's 3 phosphate groups. ADP is for diphosphate, which only has 2 phosphate groups on it, 1 and 2. And so the process of going from ADP to ATP requires energy. If we go the other way and go from ATP to ADP, it releases energy. And we can see that with this little starburst here. It shows that energy is being released. So ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and that's the energy that the cells can use. And so it provides energy for your cells to do work. So during cellular respiration, just like photosynthesis, we have a chemical reaction. And so this chemical reaction requires glucose and oxygen. And it makes carbon dioxide, water, and energy. And it makes energy in the form of ATP. So the waste products here are carbon dioxide and water. That means these two get released out of the cell. They're not needed to perform any functions. So cellular respiration takes place in the cytoplasm. Its first step takes place in the cytoplasm. And then it moves to the mitochondria. So the important parts of the mitochondria for cellular respiration are the matrix and the inner membrane. So the matrix is the inside part that is held in by the inner membrane. There are 3 stages of cellular respiration. The first stage is glycolysis, the second stage is the Krebs cycle, and lastly we have the electron transport. And so the diagram here tells you that glycolysis, we end up with 2 ATP. After the Krebs cycles, we have another 2 ATP. And then at the end of the electron transport chain, it makes 34 ATP. So when we add them all together, 2 from glycolysis, plus 2 from the Krebs cycle, plus 34 from the electron transport is up to 38 total ATP. So looking at the first stage is glycolysis. Glycolysis literally means glucose splitting. And in this step, we split the glucose molecule. And this happens in the cytoplasm. So one glucose molecule is split into two molecules of something called pyruvate. So in this process, we gain two molecules of ATP, and it does not require any oxygen. So any process that doesn't require oxygen is called anaerobic. The prefix "an" means without. So in this case, aerobic was without oxygen. So one thing to notice is that our glucose has 6 carbons. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then pyruvate, or pyruvic acid, they're the same, has only 3, but we made 2 of those. So remember, since it made 2 pyruvic acid molecules, we can take 2 molecules times 3 atoms each for a total of 6 carbon atoms. So glucose starts with 6, and we break down to something that still has 6 carbon atoms in it. The second stage is the Krebs cycle, and the Krebs cycle is cellular respiration, where the pyruvate from glycolysis is combined with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide. So this happens in the matrix of the mitochondria. And I always think that matrix looks like a swimming pool. So this is your matrix. And so this is where these reactions take place. This process gains 2 ATP molecules. And it is called an aerobic process because it requires oxygen. And so we get that in its definition as well. The third stage is called the electron transport. And this is a stage in which hydrogen combines with oxygen to produce water. And then this happens in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. And this will gain up to 34 molecules of ATP. This step also requires oxygen, and so it is another aerobic step. And so in the membrane, you can see this electron transport chain. It's fairly complicated, and what really happens is electrons move through each of these steps until eventually they combine to make water. So the products of photosynthesis are needed for cellular respiration. And then oppositely, the products of cellular respiration are needed to power photosynthesis. So these two processes store and release energy in virtually all living things, and they have to go hand in hand. So it's very important to note that cellular respiration happens in all organisms, where photosynthesis is just in autotrophs. Fermentation is a process that we use to make ATP anaerobically from glucose, and this includes glycolysis from cellular respiration because glycolysis happens anaerobically, which means, again, without oxygen. And there are 2 types of fermentation. The first type is called lactic acid fermentation, and it's a type of fermentation that occurs in some bacteria and humans when oxygen is absent. So in yogurt, in order to make yogurt, we have bacteria, and they perform lactic acid fermentation. So the first step would be to go through glycolysis and make the pyruvic acids or pyruvate molecules, and then it will go into lactic acid production. Your human muscle cells do lactic acid fermentation when the cells are working very, very hard, so like in an exercise type situation, and the blood can't get oxygen fast enough to the part of the body that's working out. So if you remember in gym class ever doing a bunch of sit-ups and you start to feel the burn in your belly from doing all the sit-ups, that's your muscles actually building up this lactic acid, and the lactic acid literally is giving your muscles a little bit of a burn. And that goes away once we get enough oxygen to that area of the body. Our second type of fermentation is alcohol fermentation. And again, this occurs without oxygen, and it produces an alcohol and a carbon dioxide. This is what yeast do, and so we use yeast in bread dough, and it releases the carbon dioxide as a gas, which results in these gas bubbles getting trapped in the bread and allows the bread dough to rise. So when we look at aerobic versus anaerobic respiration, aerobic respiration releases more energy. So remember, cellular respiration released up to 38 ATP, and it occurs when there's oxygen present. One of the downfalls of aerobic respiration is that it's very time consuming. It takes a while for it to occur. Aerobic, on the other hand, happens very quickly, but we don't get much ATP. So we get very little ATP. And this happens when there's no oxygen available. And so this is very important in deep underwater or in the soil when there's very little oxygen. So that's just a look at some of the reactions, the chemical reactions that happen inside living organisms.